Let's begin our presentation. Key strategies for leveraging change to enhance your career and your life. Today we're talking with Shanthi Flynn, who will share her incredible career journey, the unique career advancement challenges she's faced, how she made better choices. In this conversation, Shanthi will talk about self-empowerment and identifying what is my next career move, how broadening your experiences offers long-term career growth, building your confidence and personal value proposition grows your reputation, being fearless and making bold personal and career choices. Hosting today's discussion is Caroline Pfeiffer, EVP for LHH EMEA. Caroline, over to you.
Thanks, Honesty, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm Caroline Pfeiffer Marinho, Executive Vice President for LHH in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. For those of you new to LHH, we exist to find and deliver opportunities for people and companies to thrive in a changing working world. We do this through assessment, coaching, upskilling, and career transition so that companies can realize the untapped potential of their people, resulting in increased productivity, morale, and brand affinity. Today's topic, how we make change work for your career. The ability to leverage change relies on the ability to see opportunity and growth in response to it. It's critical to retain a competitive edge for organizations and ourselves individually. We are facing a lot of change recently, and many of us will need to make tough decisions. We are here to talk to Shanthi Flynn about how she's overcome obstacles, leveraged change, and made fearless choices with confidence that help her advance in her career. Shanthi is a Fortune 500 CHRO, keynote speaker, HR expert, and leadership advisor. She has over 30 years of HR leadership experience, most recently as CHRO on the executive board of the Adecco Group. Before that, Shanthi was SVP of HR at Walmart Asia, based out of Hong Kong, responsible for the people and organizational strategy for 150,000 retail employees across China, Japan, and India. Welcome, Shanthi. It's a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's my pleasure to be with all of you today.
Great. So Shanthi, let's just kick off and warm up our conversation. You have a career that spanned 30 years in progressively more senior roles, achieving the highest level in your field at global companies. Just give us a little bit of a flavor of what that journey looked like so far, and what were the key influential moments that pushed you forward?
Okay, I think without going into too much detail over so many years, I think I'll just home in on some of the pivotal moments and some of the critical decisions that I think made the biggest difference to my ability to advance. My choice to join Ford Motor Company in the UK was probably the most foundational choice. So I spent nearly 10 years there. My first 3 years were in a car plant where there were probably about 30 women and about 10,000 men on the estate. So you can imagine it was a pretty male-dominated environment. The car plant was Dagenham, which was the birthplace of the Equal Pay Act for women, if you have not seen the film made in Dagenham. So the thing that was interesting about Ford, it was a truly global company, and it invested heavily in its people and in the development of people. So I moved very quickly between jobs. So within a year or 18 months, I was changing jobs. And then your career started to slow down. So in the second half of your career, you're taking 2 or 3 years in your roles as you reach management positions. The car plant was a male-dominated and sexist environment, but it never felt personal. It was generically, broadly sexist. And it was tough. So it was a bit survival of the fittest. And I think I never really worked in a more difficult environment after that. So everything else seemed easy, which I think helped me grow my confidence, because I was able to deal with things that didn't feel always increasingly more challenging. So I think that was the first thing, was working for a company that grew me. I had bosses that helped me learn, and I was able to then, after 10 years, be able to make choices that I felt were going to be taking me in the right direction. So I then was headhunted at the age of 30 to be the HR director of a business unit for the Boots company. This was an important choice because I was pretty comfortable, had a good career. To actually leave a company where you're successful is actually an important decision sometimes. You feel nervous about making that change. So I actually felt like that was a difficult decision. But as I moved, I realized that transitioning to that new culture was easier than I really thought it was going to be. And Boots was another pioneering company.
So if I just put in a nutshell for our audience here, so you mentioned having a strong foundational start, right, in Ford, but also your first change was actually in a circumstance where everything was going well in that case, right? So taking a bold decision of not being pushed to change, but really pulling yourself to change.
Yeah, and it's interesting because sometimes the conversations I was with my now husband, he and I both decided we didn't want to live in Essex, so that was a catalyst for change. And then we said, well, if we don't want to live in Essex in the UK, well, we're going to need to move at some point. And at that point, Ford was centered for Europe in the Essex area. So sometimes peripheral things to your career may be the trigger point for your change. So yes, it was my choice to move. And then Boots was a really interesting ride for me. I was contracted to actually sell the business that I joined. So that was another unusual step, because I joined a company. I thought I'd taken a big risk, and then they said, well, actually, we're going to sell your subsidiary. And so I was extremely nervous, but we spent 2 years then preparing that business for sale, and I worked for the venture capitalist. And that was, again, an interesting time for me, because I was used to big blue chip companies that were well structured, well organized, treated people with respect. So it was a bit of a shock to deal with this guy who'd bought the company, who was rude to people. He was really quite offensive. And he didn't want to hire any of the other executives that were on the team. But he did offer me a job, and he offered to double my salary and give me a stake in the business. And this was an interesting thing for me. I was only 32 years old, and I was flattered that he was willing to offer me lots of money, but I really couldn't work for him because he was just a horrible man. So I hopefully none of you will dig around and find out who this man was, but frankly, this is also an important choice. What are your values as an individual, and making a choice to work for companies whose values align with yours, and people who treat other people well is an important choice. And I didn't think Boots would take any notice, but I did tell them that he'd offered to double my salary, and they matched it. So it was a win-win in the end. They offered me a number of different roles to stay, which was, again, I was glad, because it was a way of them recognizing that they valued me. But the only job I wanted to do was the international job, which was a new developing business. Again, it was a little bit risky. This is another bold, or some people might call a fearless, but to me, it was an obvious choice. I'd worked for global companies, but I'd never really actually grown businesses in other countries. So this was Boots's venture to go overseas with retail, and that was I was sitting on the executive team for that business unit. It was entrepreneurial, it was new, we were learning as we went, and learning by doing is definitely a mantra for me. You've got to do the work, you've got to make the decisions. You can't sit in a classroom and learn some of this stuff. So I learned how to do JV partnerships, and I learned how not to do JV partnerships, which was also an important lesson. And then it was an interesting time. So I was very pleased with the learning curve I had at the Boots company. And again, it was a decision for me to leave. I mean, my role expanded, and in the end, I was looking after FMCG healthcare, so all the international businesses, and I was sitting on 2 different executive committees now. So I had two business bosses and 1 functional boss, so 3 bosses. That was also a difficult
That's a challenge in itself.
Absolutely was, juggling priorities when you're being pulled in multiple directions. So yeah, so again, the choice to leave Boots was also mine, because my husband, I'd been traveling out to Asia, all over the world, but jumping on planes, and my husband thought it was glamorous, but I didn't really. But the glamour had definitely worn off by then. But he wanted to work overseas, so he was a teacher. He got a job in Hong Kong, so I quit my job and I followed him. He'd already in the UK moved twice to follow my job, so I thought it was fair that he got the next move. So off I went to Hong Kong.
So thank you for sharing a little bit, some nuggets around your journey so far. And I hear you had a strong foundation, which you felt was important at Ford, and you had experiences around divestiture and investment. So really living the pain side of business and the gain, and then startup environment. And I bet you could use your experience from Ford, right? And throughout your career. Just before I forget, I want to invite our audience to please put your questions on our Q&A sessions. We will do our best to have Shanthi replying to all of your questions as far as possible during this event. So please use the Q&A section for that. And Shanthi, one of the topics that we wanted to hear you about is around value proposition, right? So you talked to us about the many experiences you had. How do you, throughout your journey, create a strong value proposition? How does this play a role in your career? And you're just starting to tell us how you got to Hong Kong and how this chapter went.
Yeah, so I'll just close out the Hong Kong chapter a little bit, because the value proposition, the next move is quite an important one, which was with the Watsons Group. I had 2 children whilst I was working. I was a 40-plus mother for the first time. I had 2 children, 17 months apart. I was still working full time. And then I decided I couldn't really do either particularly well. So I stepped off the career ladder. And some people believe that this is going to damage your value proposition. But I'm a strong believer that if you make the right choices and you're competent at what you do and you're able to tell your story in a compelling way, then it won't matter if you take out time to do other things. So I was out for 3 years. I had my 3rd daughter, so I had three kids under the age of 5. I did start my own company, and this was again contributing to the value proposition, which is saying I didn't want to completely not work. So I did some work projects. I set up Flynn Consulting, and I maintained my network. The network piece is an important one, where you don't need many, you just need the right ones. And those individuals can help you maintain your presence in the marketplace. They can help you to maintain your identity from a professional perspective. So the LinkedIn profile was also an important part of my, I've never been a big one for other sorts of social media. I've never been Twitter or Facebook or other sort. I use LinkedIn, and that's where most of my own website. So my value proposition sits there, and my branding and who I am. But actually, your value proposition also sits with the people you've touched over the years, because whenever I come into contact with a former colleague, and you can talk to many of them, but that if they reach out to me and ask for my help, I will always help them. So your value proposition doesn't just sit with your career or your career decisions or even your job that you do at any given point in time. It's how you add value to people in your life generally. And that's how I see value. That's how I see my personal brand, as being a normal, authentic person. Hopefully, sometimes with my ego might get the better of me, but actually I hope to maintain some humility, knowing that actually as I get older, I know less than I would hope that I really would want to learn. But yeah, so value proposition is maintained in a number of different ways. But when I took my career break out, it tested that value proposition, because I didn't think that I would get back into the corporate world. I thought, now I've got 3 kids. It's hard to step back into a senior role, and 3 years out, and I was used to making fast decisions. I was confident, and I realized that actually this was the first dent to my confidence that I'd ever had. I thought my brains had turned to mush. My vocabulary seemed to have descended to about 45 words. And yet the headhunter still rang me once in a while and asked me if I wanted to go and do a job, and I didn't want to. And then a funny thing happened, which was my older daughter, who was only about 3 or 4 at the time, kept biting her younger sister on the face. And I found myself saying over and over again, "Stop biting your sister," which was a phrase that I didn't think I would be saying. Anyway, Heidrick and Struggles rang me that afternoon and asked me if I wanted to talk to Walmart about a job, and I just said yes. So that's how I ended up working for Walmart for 5 years.
Great story on biting your sister in that case. How this can push you back to work.
Unusual catalyst for your to trigger your career path. I wouldn't say that it's always planned. So
yeah. So we have a couple of questions coming in from our audience, and one person here is asking, what would you recommend regarding the frequency of changes between companies and even positions? How would you recommend to get broad experience in different fields and different kinds of companies? You actually work for different industries, right? What's your point of view on this?
Well, I think breadth is always a good thing, but depth is also important. So you need to ground your skills and expertise, and therefore make yourself valuable from a technical point of view. So you have to be good at something. But then when you broaden out your context, so when I say breadth, it could be a change in industry, it could be a change in country. So I've worked in the UK, but I've worked in multiple places in the UK. I worked in retail and manufacturing. I've worked with FMCG healthcare. I've worked with services. I've worked with big box and small box retail. Now, they're all very different, but they add a value to you because you get to, but only if you get to understand those businesses and how they tick. If you go in and you sit in your functional bubble and you don't learn how your job connects to the business as a whole, or how you can add value in that context, then you won't get the most out of it. But that's what I mean by breadth. Sometimes it's scale. So the reason I actually took a step back when I went to Walmart. For the first time in 15 years, I was not working for the general manager of the business and heading up the HR function. After I had my career break, I actually was working for the SVP of the HR function for the region. But he then went after 6 months, and they promoted me anyway. So it wasn't stepping back for long. But I knew that, it was a $25 billion US business covering 3 very big trading markets, 150,000 people. It was plenty of scope and complexity that I knew that no matter what my job title was, I was going to learn a lot there. So I think in growing your resume, you have to think, am I learning something new that I think is valuable and that I would like to do more of? There's no point broadening yourself out into areas that you don't really want to do. You've got to know yourself, and I've also avoided some industries that don't fit well with me. So use your own value.
So talking about learning, someone here is asking, having done all these things in your career, what would you still want to learn?
Oh gosh, I learn all the time. And maybe they're not career things. I'm trying to learn German, but I realize my brain is getting too old to learn it fast. But I try and dedicate at least an hour a day to doing my German lessons and German learning. I've learned to grow vegetables, so I'm eating my own vegetables. I read a lot, and, you know, I like to make sure that I'm always learning something new about the world. You know, I'm a passionate advocate for meritocracy, so I will write articles and blogs which are featured on my website, opinions that I hold about things. But in order to hold those opinions, I often have to research them, and sometimes they're into areas, for example, education reform. I'm a big believer that the higher education system of 18 plus needs to be reformed. So, you know, I have to learn around that if I'm going to have an impact. So I hope that answered that question.
Very much so. And Shanthi, you mentioned that during your break, it was important to you to keep your networking alive and potentially even building it out. Someone here is asking, do you have an advice on how to build a network as someone newly entering into the workforce? How to build valuable connections outside your current job?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes LinkedIn is a kind of blessing and a curse. You know, because you can be in contact with people, but not really be in contact with people. So they're not what I would call the same network connections. You may be networked via LinkedIn, but that's not what I would describe as a network connection. A network connection needs to be somebody tangible that you can either get advice from, or they are willing to support you in reaching other important people. So one example of that was when I went to Hong Kong for the first time. I had no network. I didn't know anybody at all. So the first thing I did was go and reach out to, I asked a headhunter. I went to a headhunter and I said I was around, even though I wasn't looking for a job. And I asked them who the best network people were in my space. And they gave me about 3 names. And with those 3 names, I was pretty much networked to about 200 people. So sometimes you have to find a connection that is really relevant to what you want to do. And then you follow certain trails, but you have to meet and have a tangible conversation with somebody in that network connection, and, you know, go for a coffee or try and have a phone call with them. Now with coronavirus limiting social connection directly, you can have a phone call or a Zoom call, and then you are building a presence with other people and you're asking advice. But before reaching out, you have to have an idea of what it is that you want from them in terms of advice or even sponsorship. You know, I'd like to work for the company you work for. How do I do that? So you have to have some questions that you need answering. Because if you turn up and you're meeting or you're ringing someone and they say, so why are you calling me? And you have no clue, that's not going to help you. So you do have to be a little bit structured in the way you approach those network connections. But in Hong Kong, I didn't need many.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the word advice. Tiffany is asking here a question, which I think is nice. As today we are trying to learn and get some tips out of your experience. Was there any advice or a piece of advice that you have gotten throughout your life that really made something click and that you would want to share with us?
Oh gosh. Well, the be bold and fearless is one of them. Is that sometimes people overthink things. I think you have to think through decisions, you know, carefully, but there's always an element of leap where you don't know, you cannot gather all the facts. And, you know, when I left Hong Kong, my family were happy in Hong Kong. They didn't really want to leave. And I had to convince my 3 daughters that actually going to Zurich was going to be great. And I had to tap into their psychology by saying, you know, showing them pictures of the ski slopes, and saying that skiing was an after school activity, which obviously tapped into them. But that was quite tough because they didn't want to change. So it's not just you that has to take a risk. Sometimes the people around you are taking a risk too. So you have to be persuasive in taking that chance. But I think once you have thought through, does it make financial sense? Do I have enough of a buffer if things go wrong? Do I have a get out plan? Am I willing to put up with grief for a period of time, even if it's not great? Can I get through that? So you do have to be a bit more resilient and weather a few knocks. But I would say that if there's something you want to do, an adventure you want to take, when we went to Hong Kong, it was not really a career adventure. It was just simply an adventure. We had successful, stable careers. We were in our mid-30s. We felt a little bit middle-aged. We had plenty of disposable income. We had no kids. And then, so we wanted an adventure, and that was the catalyst. I think sometimes people feel a bit nervous about doing that. Now, I would not feel nervous about going to many countries in the world to live or work. And I think that would be my biggest lesson in life. Embrace it.
Yeah, and you mentioned, so you taking risk yourself and others taking it with you, right? We have a question here that's a little bit in that direction. So someone is asking, what is your advice for broadening breadth when a person is drawn in a specific type of industry and has worked in similar industry for the majority of their careers, and becoming comfortable in taking risk or switching industry, as well as making a new employer taking the risk with you?
Yeah, you need to be able to turn what you know into some generic competencies. So unless you are actually working on a COVID vaccine, which is pretty technical and specialized, and people are going to want you to carry on doing that, most people can convert what they do into competencies that can be translated into other areas. So even though my whole career has been spent in HR, I would say I was also business focused. I listened to and contributed to many strategic plans. But I could also say that my generic core skill is complex problem solving, because that's really that's the core. I'm able to, look at certain types of issues and be able to solve certain types of problems. But by switching into, if you've got a very narrow skill set and you find it difficult to translate that, you can look beyond your career and look at other things that you might do in your life. Maybe you're the captain of a football team, or there are other things that talk to your competencies, not just the work that you do. And you need to convert those into things that sound meaningful to an employer who wants to take a chance on you. So, that sounds easy to do, but it actually takes quite a lot of soul searching for you to actually do that. And you have to be quite deliberate about what it is that you're looking for, because sometimes people are too vague about what it is that they just want to change, but they're not specific enough. So you do have to narrow down what kind of change you want and why, and then try and make those connections so that and also your network is important. So I'll just tell one story about, it was a mentee. I was a board mentor for Critical Eye in Asia. And my mentee was working for a pharma company as a general manager. And she was saying that her next job needed to be a regional manager. And I said, well, okay, but ultimately, what do you want to do? And she said, I want to be head of vaccines. And I said, well, does that regional general manager job get you on that path? And she said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, why don't you talk to the head of vaccines and find out and look at their resume and find out what they did and whether it's feasible. Anyway, within 2 years, she was deputy head of vaccines. So she switched, but she made a more deliberate choice in the right direction to get where she wanted to go, rather than just stepping up on one career path. Actually, she needed to go in a slightly different direction to get where she wanted to go. I don't know whether
that absolutely answers. Talking about stepping up and stepping up, when we hear successful stories like yours, it sounds like stepping up. And one might wonder, and someone is asking here, can you share a specific bad experience or failure you had throughout your career and how you handled it?
Oh gosh, I have plenty of those. Well, I mean, when I was at Walmart, they closed the regional offices down across the world and centralized all the functions. So I kind of knew it was coming because my boss of 5 years, who was a complete control freak, moved to the US, and I knew he would centralize everything because he needed to control everything. And when he was in the region, he was an advocate for regions. But when he went to the center, I knew he'd want to get rid of the region. So I think that, you get laid off. Sometimes chemistry can just work against you. You have to be the best version of yourself as often as you can be. And and sometimes that doesn't work and you're not the best person. And sometimes you make mistakes. Sometimes you're stressed and you mess things up. And what I hang on to is, actually, I've done some pretty cool stuff. There's lots of careers out there that I've helped to build. And those individuals will reach out to me and say thanks every now and then. And so I always feel that there's a hell of a lot more good than bad that I've done in my career. And I hang on to those because there's no point dwelling on things going wrong. You just have to say, most of the time things go right. And if you focus in on those things that go right, then you can move past. It sometimes takes a long time, particularly if a relationship goes bad. Like if you end up just falling out with people, and that's happened with me before, where a chemistry just simply hasn't worked. And if your chemistry with a CEO, or in positions like mine where you're head of an HR function, you have to have chemistry with the CEO. If it doesn't work out, then that's it. I'm totally philosophical about that. I mean, when I got my Walmart job, I'll digress for a second, is he nearly didn't give me the SVP HR job because I wasn't willing to travel as much as he wanted me to. He wanted me to travel 75% of the time. And I said, look, I've got 3 kids under 5. I'm not traveling 75% of the time, but I think I can do the job on 25 to 30% travel. We've only got 3 trading countries. I don't need to be on a plane all the time, except to the US. I can plan it. And if I need to be on a plane, I'll get on a plane. And he said, well, no, I really want someone who's willing, and I've heard this a number of times. I've worked with CEOs who insist on people traveling like crazy. So that's one positive outcome from COVID, is that hopefully that will change. And in the end, I said, look, I'm best qualified for this job. You'd be mad not to take me. And he said, well, so if you're in my shoes, would you give yourself the job? And I said, well, of course I would. And I said, well, what the worst thing that can happen is if I fail, you can fire me or demote me. Nothing lost. So anyway, he promoted me, and we worked together for 5 years. But, that could have gone the other way. If I had just taken what he'd said and accepted it, then, I might not have got that job, and my career might have taken a different turn. So,
or you would have not to be true to yourself and then sustain this, right? So you mentioned a lot, staying true to yourself, being authentic, having the chemistry, which fits well actually with another question from our audience. How do you grow in your career without having to be a masculine figure or having a masculine personality? True to yourself in that case.
Yeah, I'd hope that's me. But sometimes, these traits of feminine and masculine traits are assigned to men or women, and actually, women can be called bullies if they're assertive, and sometimes negative labels are attributed to women when they are tough, or they're decisive, or they take tough decisions. They're somehow labeled differently. And I think that's one of the things that I've tried to counteract over the years, that you can be tough, you can be decisive, those aren't male characteristics. Lots of women can be tough and decisive. The question is, what I do believe though, is I think that sometimes women can become sort of overly concerned about being a female. I've almost always worked in male-dominated environments. I've almost always been the only woman on an executive committee or on an executive team. I've rarely had an ethnic minority sitting alongside me, let alone another woman. It's happened so rarely that you have to just be yourself, because otherwise, if you try and copy all the men in the room, you're not bringing anything different to the table. So I see it as a point of leverage, but you have to be confident, you have to be well prepared, you have to do your homework, because if you go into a room where people are expecting you maybe to not be so assertive, you have to be able to be convincing and tell your story and hold your ground sometimes. And I see all those as being characteristics that don't mean you're more male or more female. But you do have to support women. I've known too many women over the years and seen them, the Margaret Thatcher syndrome, where you don't help other women in their careers. And I feel very strongly about helping other women to progress as well. And I think you shouldn't be quite so lonely in the higher levels of leadership.
And we have quite a few questions actually coming from women on this specific topic. I'll just try to bundle a few of them so that you can share a little bit more. What advice do you have for younger female professionals who want to grow their careers while juggling wanting to have a family? And then someone else here is saying, I'm sitting with my 18-month-old daughter on my lap and we are both entrailed with this wonderful session. Thank you. What is important to you to be a good role model to your daughters?
Oh, well, it's funny because, you know, I think they see me as being on the phone and going to meetings and running off, and they don't really associate, they don't really understand the jobs that I've done. They know that they're high profile because I do interviews like this sometimes, or I'm speaking to people. So they know that what I've done, and they can see, if they Google me, they see I come up, you know, a reasonable amount. So they're proud of me, but I'm not sure they understand why they should be proud of me. Until they enter the world, it's a hard thing to convey. But, you know, the way I've balanced, sometimes everyone has to balance in their own way that allows them to be true to their own priorities. So if I can't do my job as well as I can possibly do it, I tend to step out and do my family work. So, you know, I've taken twice, I've done consulting work at important times in my life, which has meant that I know the corporate world can become 120%. And I've traveled a lot. You know, when I was at the Adecco Group, I did more than 350,000 air miles in 2 years. But I pretty much got to all my kids' concerts, and I don't think I've missed any really important events in their lives. Never missed a birthday. So I've always made their birthday cakes. They might not have been grateful for my brand of birthday cake making, but that's my way of managing that. But you know, when I was at Walmart, I had a video conferencing unit at home. I would do calls at 10 or 11 o'clock at night on a VC, but I'd be hanging out with my kids or picking them up from school at 4 till 6. I was available. I would tell my team I'm available from these times to these times. I was completely transparent about my whereabouts. I communicate fiercely with my boss about what I've done and where we are with projects and objectives, so they never have to chase me, which meant that it was easy to be more flexible. To ask for flexibility when you haven't earned the trust and the confidence of the people around you is harder. So in some ways I was lucky because I had my kids late. So my career had already developed to quite a level. I think it's tougher when you're at the earlier stages of your career and you're juggling a young family, because you haven't got quite enough of the work experience to hang on to. But there's nothing to stop you when you get a moment to teach yourself or to learn new skills. And then if you do manage to get a job back, is perhaps you need to go full time and then go flex later. But I found that managing my time with my kids in a kind of, I would call it along the timeline rather than in a given day. So there may be 2 weeks where I'm traveling and I haven't seen them, but I'd be on FaceTime, etc. But then I'll step off and I'll be with them for 2 years, you know. So it's a different way of balancing over time, over a lifetime rather than necessarily over a week.
Great. Shall we get philosophical? You mentioned a couple of minutes ago that you are philosophical about chemistry and working for people. So here's a philosophical question. What is the key difference between purpose and value proposition?
Yeah, purpose is an interesting one, because I was always a passionate advocate for purpose until I actually realized I didn't really have much purpose at the moment. In the last couple of years, I've made my own purpose. And I've realized that actually sometimes we can become slaves to purpose. And just enjoying your life in the moment is a really important thing that can be underestimated. You know, my husband and I, we lost 2 siblings in a week, both to ill health. And it makes you, you know, you become just more aware of your mortality. And purpose is important, of course, and knowing that you're adding value to the lives of others. But if I look back over my career, my biggest purpose is the fact that I feel like I've added value to the careers and lives of other people. And I feel pleased and proud of that there are lots of people that will have got the positions that they've had, have been recruited into positions and grown in organizations because of the role that I've played. Sometimes I've saved people's careers when they were hanging on a knife edge because somebody wanted to fire them, and I protected them. So there's plenty of those too. So I think your purpose needs to come from, do you want to add value to an individual, to a group of individuals, to the planet, and add the value in the way that you think is most meaningful to who you are, so you can be your authentic self. If you have to work really, really hard to pretend to be something you're not in order to achieve a purpose, then it's the wrong purpose.
Mm-hmm. And you briefly mentioned that purpose sometimes can get lost in the long term. And in a previous conversation we had, you briefly mentioned that sometimes you were not so concerned about the long term, but rather what are the next steps. Tell us a little bit about this.
I have to say, even though I've given plenty of people advice in about their careers, I've been quite opportunistic in my own. So if someone had said to me 5 years ago that you'd be living in Zurich, I would have said, why, you know, because I was happy in Hong Kong. So I think the most important thing is that when either you find a reason to change or change is presented to you, that those opportunistic moments present at a moment in time that allows you to take a different decision or a different course. And grabbing those opportunities or not, as the case may be. So, you know, I was asked to go for a very interesting role. My whole family said, oh yeah, that'll be great. Go and work for that individual who's very, very well known, and it would be so cool if you work for them. And I said, actually, no, I don't want that job. I don't want to work for that person. I think they're a fantastic individual, but I don't want to do that. So sometimes you can be tempted by things that take you off on a journey that you don't want. So you just have to really, if in planning ahead, if you are clear, and some people are, I was never clear that I always wanted responsibility. That was my ambition, that I liked responsibility. I like taking decisions. I like to be in places where I can learn, and I like to be surrounded by people I like. And, you know, and that's the kind of culture that I like to be in. So when you're operating with those kinds of parameters, it's then easier to make micro decisions. But if you know that you want to be the CEO of a Fortune 100 company, then your career path needs to be much more definite. You need to know that you're taking steps that deliberately are taking you on a journey. And you need to be moving fast when you're young. That's the big thing. So
considering there are only 100 Fortune 500, there are not more than that, so 100 jobs out there, and we are more than that on this webinar. What do we then, that are not the hundreds, do when we need to course correct? What is the one career decision you have taken that, looking back, you would have done differently, and how you course corrected? It's one of the questions that popped up here.
Course correction. Actually, I don't think I would have done anything massively different, really. I think the time was right to leave Ford after 10 years. I had many colleagues who stayed for another 5, but I thought that was the right time, so I probably wouldn't change that decision. Boots. It was an interesting company. I would work for them again. I would work for Walmart again. I would work for Ford again. I would work for all those companies again. I thought they were incredibly innovative and interesting. I learned a lot from them and the people. What would I do? There are lots of small decisions within my career that I might do differently, or I would implement this system rather than something else. But I don't think from a career path perspective, I would change anything. I feel like I've really learned a lot in every organization I've been in. And I like the countries I've lived in and the places. So actually, I'm sorry to be a buzzkill on that one, but I don't think I would really change. I very rarely look back. I always look forward, really. So I don't.
Maybe that's the reason, right?
Might be why I don't ever. I just think, yeah, sometimes it doesn't work out, but I'll just put it down to experience.
Yeah, and if we are more looking forward than looking back, we have less chances or opportunities to regret. We really are future focused. So we have here an HR professional who has grown his or her career as a generalist senior HRBP and is wanting to take the next level up as head of HR. His fear and factor is on how to really contribute to the business discussion within an exec group. You have been there. What would be your advice to this person? And I think it's actually in a lot of HR's professionals' head. Do I have the right seat at the table to discuss business or not? So what's your point of view?
Well, I mean, frankly, I've been, you have to, it is in your hands to have a seat at the table. If you cannot talk the language of the business, you've got to learn it. And that means going to the, I had a great colleague, Greg Foran, who was the Walmart CEO, US Walmart CEO, who's my business partner when he was head of the China business for Walmart. So he and I are still in touch, and I've been looking at some of his LinkedIn feeds because he just took over as CEO of Air New Zealand. And the first thing, he's always been a retailer. He started in the stores. He worked his way up. He did not have a degree. He went all the way up to the top of the tree as CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world. He's one of the best, smartest leaders I've had the privilege to work with. And the first thing he did is get on a plane and start serving customers on a plane. So he's learning that business from the front end. And I knew he would do that because he knows the stores, so he's getting on a plane, he's going to sit next to a pilot and work out what they're doing. And he doesn't need to know the job of a pilot. He just needs to know what their day is like. He needs to know what kinds of decisions that they're taking. He needs to know where the money is being made and where the money is being lost. That's all you need to know in a business. How does the money get made and how does it get lost? And if you know those things and the factors that contribute to that, you will add value in any organization, because then all you have to do is work out, how do I help have that company make more money and lose less? How do I help this company simplify things so that they are more effective and more efficient? How do I make sure that we've got a great talent pipeline so that we're never fishing around randomly for people? So there's lots of things that you need to do, but you do need to go to the core of the business and understand exactly how it works. And then you need to peel it back. And as you move into having business discussions, when you talk about HR, you need to line it up with the business itself. Why is this HR decision important to the business? And if you can connect the dots between those two, you will be welcome at the table. You also have to hear what they say about what's important to them. And sometimes you have to say, well, yes, that is important, but don't you think this factor is more important? What's the end game? What are you really trying to achieve? And it may be that they believe that one solution is more important, but you may know that a different solution will still get them where they need to go, and it will get them there faster. Mm-hmm. So talking their language in a way that connects with them is the way you help get your seat at the table. But you have to be numerate. You have to understand a P&L and be able to understand what people are talking about when they're in the room and comment on it. I mean, I've never just commented on HR matters. I've always commented on other aspects of the business.
So we talked a little bit about new entrants or younger professionals networking. We talked about advancing in your career, taking a break. What about aging workers? One question here we have is, do you feel the weight of age coming? And what is the advice you have for a career change for your last corporate job?
Well, actually, I think I've probably already done my last corporate job. I think the travel and all of that, I'm probably past that. And now my career is very much in the advisory space. I do public speaking. I'll do events like this. I'm helping some companies to evaluate their strategies from a people and organization perspective. So doing advisory work and helping CEOs and HR leaders build a better organization that I don't necessarily need to be responsible for is the next phase. And people talk about portfolio careers now, and I'd say that's the space I'm in right now, which means that I will do, you know, I'm on the ETH. You may not be familiar with it, but Zurich has a technical university, and I'm one of their global ambassadors. So I'm part of a number of different kinds of networks where think tanks that help me to continue to contribute to society and to the lives of others. So I'm a passionate advocate for allowing people, irrespective of their wealth, to be able to progress in their life and their careers. And unfortunately, the world has become a little bit too heavy on needing money to get on. And I know that if I was born now, I would possibly not have reached the level I have. I was born at the right time. It's harder because graduates are coming out saddled with debt, and I didn't have to go through that. So when you're from humble beginnings, that's harder. So I'm an advocate for a number of different things. And so I see myself contributing to society in a different way to being purely in the corporate world now.
So thank you, Shanthi. You mentioned in what you just said about giving people opportunities and making them thrive, which links well with one of the questions here. How do you see the advancement of diversity and inclusion in corporate world?
Oh, that's all a bit depressing, I have to say. You know, I've been battling this one for over 30 years. And one of my jobs when I was at Ford was equal opportunities manager. So this was about providing equal opportunities to women, to different minority groups, and also trying to rebuild the organization when it faced class action lawsuits for diversity issues, which it did, discrimination and all sorts of things. So I would have hoped that the boardrooms of, you know, big companies would be close to 50% by now, but they're not. I would have hoped that despite the Equal Pay Act being forged in Dagenham in 1966 or 67, that we still wouldn't have a 20 to 30% pay gap for the same job between men and women. But unfortunately, those things are still the case, which means that they still need to be battled for. And each individual has a responsibility to try to do their part, either as an individual looking to go into a new job. You need to make sure that you're being paid on a par, particularly as you enter an organization, because once you're in, your steps become more incremental. So if your pay is not in the right space at the beginning, it's very hard to bridge it later. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of things that actually are not working well. And frankly, the rhetoric of politicians is not what it should be either. So we do seem to have, and I hate to be too political, but I'm afraid you're going to get my opinions unabridged, is, you know, our political leaders should be advocating equality. They should be encouraging diversity in all ways. But it's not just, diversity is a fact, inclusion is a behavior.
Yeah. So let's make sure we all take our own role in this and have a different conversation in a couple of years' time, right? More with more solutions and results. So we have just a couple of minutes left. And our talk today was about self-empowerment, broadening your experiences, building confidence and personal value proposition, being fearless, and making bold personal career choices. So I could not miss asking, considering COVID and everything that we are calling the new normal or resetting reality, for each of us individually taking ownership, what would be your career advice for the future?
And I do think it's a difficult time for young people who are separated from the people they need to learn from. I think this is the toughest for them. If you're a bit more mature, you're a senior manager, you know the work you need to do, you know your objectives, it's not so difficult. You can do a lot of your work remotely if you're not in a customer-facing environment. If you are able to do a lot of your work remotely, then it doesn't need to change. But if you need to learn how to do something, I think that's a challenge. So I'm just trying to think
of an advice.
Now, the advice I would give is that you need to reach out to individuals who you think might be able to guide and advise you on particular specific areas where you need to get expertise. So think of that expertise that you're seeking and look for the people who have it, who can give you direct advice and support, because you still need to continue to learn as opposed to just get through tasks.
Great. So be deliberate about learning opportunities, even in these difficult times of isolation. That's great advice for us. Shanthi, I want to thank you very much for your time and sharing your thoughts with us today. Thank you everyone who joined us today, and I really look forward to see you again.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.